Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to recap an American slasher film called Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Spoilers ahead. The film begins by playing a DVD that recaps the events of the original film. In it, a group of teenagers are slaughtered when they encounter a murderous family living in rural Texas. The only survivor was a young woman named Sally Hardesty. After she escaped, the chainsaw-wielding killer nicknamed Leatherface, wearing the faces of his victims, took off his mask and disappeared. The DVD is playing in a gas station and is seen by a young woman named Lila. Lila asks the gas station attendant what happened to Sally. The guard says she has spent her life trying to find the killer of her family and friends. Lila goes outside to join her sister Melody, Mel. The girls travel with Melody's boyfriend Dante and his girlfriend Ruth. They drive to an abandoned Texas town called Harlow. Dante, a social media influencer, purchased the city in a bankruptcy sale. He plans to sell the properties to wealthy young adults so they can build a new, more idyllic and modern community. As they drive to Harlow, they get into a fight with an angry Texan named Richter and meet the two police officers in charge of the town. The Texans are all suspicious of Dante's plans for the city. When the four arrive in Harlow, they learn that the contractor responsible for restoring the buildings is Richter. Later, they meet an old woman named Mrs. Mick, who still lives in an orphanage in the city that she used to run. Ms. Mick claims she has paid off her debts to the bank and is still the legal owner of her orphanage. Dante is offended by her anti-racial comments and her family's Confederate heritage and worried that she will ruin his plans for the city. So Dante calls the police to drive them away. As the officers escort Ms. Mick out of the house, she suffers a medical incident. A huge man goes down the stairs to help her. Mick explains that this man is her last orphan and has lived with her for years. The man, the officers, Mrs. Mick and Ruth all get into the ambulance to take Mrs. Mick to a hospital. Although Mel and Lila are upset with how Dante handled the encounter, Dante remains focused on continuing the auction. As the ambulance leaves, a party bus arrives filled with wealthy young investors. Lila wanders through town and finds Richter working in his shop. She notices that he has an assault weapon and reveals that she is the survivor of a mass school shooting. Lila admits that she has survivor's guilt and says that everyone expects great things from her, but she doesn't think she has anything to offer. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mick dies in the ambulance and Ruth texts Dante the bad news. The man begins to act violently in his grief. The officer behind him tries to pull out his gun, but the man tears the officer's hand from his arm and then stabs him in the throat with the officer's exposed arm bones. He then shoots the other officer and the ambulance crashes into abandoned farm equipment. Back in town, Richter learns of the eviction and death of Mrs. Mick. He steals the keys to Dante's car and the party bus, saying he will only return them if Dante can prove he is the rightful owner of the orphanage. Dante searches his files and cannot find the certificate. Now angered that they may have treated Mrs. Mick unfairly and accidentally killed her, Mel insists that they search her house to see if she has the deed she claimed. At the crash site, Ruth regains consciousness. She sees in the side mirror that the large man is scraping the front of Mrs. Mick's body and applying it to his body. This man is Leatherface. She takes the police radio and tries to radio for help, but the only person who can hear her is the gas station attendant. Leatherface then kills the other officer he shot earlier by smashing his head with Mrs. Mick's oxygen tank. Although Ruth tries to play dead and later escape, Leatherface discovers that Ruth is alive and kills her by slashing her stomach with a knife. Leatherface then goes back to Harlow. Meanwhile, the gas station attendant calls his old friend Sally Hardesty, now an old woman. Sally grabs a supply of weapons and heads to Harlow. Leatherface returns to his orphanage, where Dante and Mel have split up to look for the deed, with Mel finding the deed upstairs, proving that Mrs. Mick was the rightful owner after all. Leatherface attacks Dante and chops his face with a meat cleaver. He then goes upstairs where Mel is hiding under a bed. Leatherface sits down and begins to make up his mask when he hears the sounds of partygoers outside. He sees the investors celebrating and gets angry. Leatherface gets a sledgehammer and starts smashing into the bedroom wall. Inside is his old chainsaw. Although mutilated, Dante is barely alive. He stumbles outside and runs into Richter and one of the partygoers. He warns them about Leatherface before he dies from his wounds. Richter grabs a gun and goes to the orphanage while the partygoer forces Lila and all the investors to get back on the party bus. Richter walks into the orphanage, as Leatherface hides behind a door to ambush him. Mel is able to twist a nearby mirror, allowing Richter to see Leatherface hiding. The two fight, but Leatherface wins when he smashes Richter in the knee with a sledgehammer. Leatherface impales Richter on a piece of glass and Richter collapses to the ground, where he sees Mel hiding under the bed. Richter throws the keys to the vehicles to Mel before Leatherface finishes him off by bashing Richter's head in with the sledgehammer. On her journey, Sally sees the ambulance crash site. She stops to investigate and finds that Leatherface has turned Mrs. Mick's corpse into a grotesque monument. Meanwhile, Lila gets off the bus to look for Mel and finds Dante's body. As Leatherface goes into another room to repair his chainsaw, Mel sneaks out and tries to get to the exit. Leatherface catches her and a fight ensues, with Mel falling through the floorboards of the old building. As she makes her way through the crawl space, Leatherface attempts to rip her into pieces through the floorboards with his now functional chainsaw. Mel escapes when Lila hears the commotion and is able to break open a basement window so Mel can crawl through. The sisters escape to the bus with the keys and demand that the driver get off immediately. The bus starts moving but mysteriously stops. The driver gets out to investigate and then his severed head is thrown back into the bus by Leatherface. The investors immediately pull out their phones and start recording Leatherface, threatening to cancel the killer. Leatherface responds by revving up his chainsaw and killing them all. Lila and Mel manage to escape the carnage through an emergency exit in the ceiling and begin to flee. They see a car idling in the city and jump in. They find that the car is being driven by Sally, who refuses to leave. Instead, Sally gets out and chases Leatherface back to the orphanage. Inside, Sally finds her old tormentor. She holds a shotgun to his head and demands that he acknowledge who she is and what he has done to her family and friends. Leatherface says nothing and just pushes past Sally when he hears Mel and Lila outside. Realizing that Leatherface either doesn't remember her or no longer cares about her, Sally attacks Leatherface and throws her car keys toward the girls. Sally and Leatherface fight. Although she grazes him with one shot and manages to stab him in the stomach, Leatherface stabs her through the stomach with his chainsaw. Leatherface lifts Sally off the ground so she sinks further onto his saw blade before throwing her into a pile of trash. Mel tries to run over Leatherface with the car, but Leatherface swerves and Mel falls. Mel is impaled through the leg and is unable to escape as Lila runs off without her. Leatherface slowly walks towards Mel, ignoring Mel's apologies for what happened to Mrs. Mick. Lila returns with Richter's assault rifle, but doesn't know how to use it. Leatherface pursues Lila and is shot several times by the still-living Sally as they get outside. A wounded Leatherface runs into a nearby abandoned theater. Lila goes to Sally, who says that if Lila runs away, she will be haunted by Leatherface forever just like Sally. Lila decides to stay and fight when Sally dies. She takes the shotgun and enters the theater. Meanwhile, Mel pulls out the pole that was used to attach her leg to the crashed vehicle. Leatherface manages to lure Lila into an ambush and the two fall into a pit filled with water. Lila shows up first, but Leatherface gets out and grabs her before she can reach the shotgun she dropped. Before Leatherface can kill Lila, Mel jumps on his back. This gives Lila the time she needs to grab the shotgun and shoot Leatherface twice. Mel then grabs Leatherface's chainsaw and cuts his throat and face. The Leatherface falls into the pit and the sisters watch him sink to the ground before hugging. The women get into a self-driving car and activate the autopilot. As the car pulls out of Harlow, Leatherface mysteriously appears and breaks the passenger side window to drag Mel out of the car. As the car continues to drive away, a crying Lila screams as Leatherface decapitates Mel with his chainsaw. Then Leatherface begins dancing with Mel's severed head and his beloved chainsaw. In a post-credit scene, Leatherface walks down a dirt road to the house where he grew up and where he killed Sally's family. So, that's the end of our movie. If you've come this far, make sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe my channel. See you later.